Our witnesses are all joining us today via the video conference, and so today we welcome in our first panel Melissa Arcand, soil biochemist from the University of Saskatchewan, and Candice Pete-Cardoso, Director of Indigenous Land Management Institute at the University of Saskatchewan. And so with that, colleagues, I'd invite you to listen to the presentations by Dr. Arcand and Ms. Pete-Cardoso, and then we'll move into questions. Dr. Arcand.
Thank you, and Tanse, good morning. Melissa Arcand, Nitsigasun, Muskego Sagaiganik, Ochinia. My name is Melissa Arcand. I'm from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6 territory. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan, where part of my research program focuses on evaluating soil health on the agricultural lands of First Nations in Saskatchewan. I teach an environmental science field course to First Nation students in the Kanewetetan Aski, Let Us Take Care of the Land in Plains Cree, Indigenous Land Management Certificate Program. Along with my colleague Candice Pete-Cardoso, I'm the academic director of the Indigenous Land Management Institute at USask, soon to be renamed as the Kichi Okawimau Aski, translated to Great Mother Earth Knowledge Center. Thank you to the honorable members of the committee for inviting me to add to this important conversation of soil health in Canada. I'm briefly going to highlight the roles that Indigenous peoples play in protecting and building soil health and where soil health may be at risk, specifically for First Nations in the prairies where I live and work. So first, it's really important to state that all soils in Canada are on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. The prairies, which were once home to vast expanses of native grassland, now comprise more than 80% of Canada's agricultural land base, all of which are on treaty territories. It is these rich, fertile soils developed over millennia under native grassland, grazed by bison in close relationship with Indigenous peoples, that support agricultural production in this region. And while agriculture has become a dominant land use on most First Nations reserves across the prairies, the land is primarily farmed by non-Indigenous producers that rent it from the First Nation. Indigenous peoples' agricultural knowledge and traditional Indigenous knowledge has been undermined and marginalized over time as agricultural management decisions have devolved outside of the community to non-Indigenous producers. Indigenous peoples have historically been left out of soil science and agricultural education. First Nation students are underrepresented in the soil science and agricultural fields at the undergraduate and graduate levels across Canada, and thus Indigenous professionals in these fields are incredibly rare. Mr. Ken Bear, who you'll hear from in the next hour, he's one of the exceptions. Limited soil science and agriculture education of First Nations people pose a risk to soil health on First Nations reserved lands. There's a need to increase access to soil and agricultural training for First Nations people at all levels of education and for a variety of roles. The most immediate need could protect soil health. The most immediate need that could protect soil health is to increase training available to First Nations land managers who are the frontline workers. So in addition to education, First Nations access to soil information is limited, even to soil data collected on their own lands, which constrains sustainable soil management. Historically, First Nations have not had strong relationships with soil data collectors and holders, such as universities, governments, and the agricultural industry. For many First Nations in Saskatchewan, the only soil data they might have access to are 60-year-old soil survey reports, which are useful for land use planning, but not for evaluating changes in soil health. And while many producers who farm First Nations land may be collecting soil data to guide fertilizer applications, results of soil tests are not commonly shared with the First Nation. Resources are needed to support soil data collection and management by First Nations for their own lands. Initiatives in soil data management developed through a national soil health strategy could be modeled and applied for First Nations use. Also, the Indigenous Guardians program may be a potential avenue for training Indigenous soil health monitors. In spite of gaps in soil science knowledge from a Western perspective, Indigenous peoples currently protect and maintain soil health on lands that they govern. Indigenous values of Wakotuin respect the kinship between ourselves and the living and non-living members of the ecosystem, leading to the careful use of these lands that promote biodiversity and soil protection. At the global scale, Indigenous governed lands harbor 80% of biodiversity. On the prairies, we can plainly see from satellite imagery that perennial land cover on First Nations reserved lands is more dominant than in the surrounding rural municipalities. This existing land stewardship needs to be more strongly recognized, and resources for First Nations to support and expand Indigenous protected and conserved areas into the prairies is needed. This could also make way for restoration of marginal cropland for bison rematriation. Indeed, many First Nations are restoring their relationship with the buffalo by returning them to their lands, and also some becoming signatories to the Buffalo Treaty. Our knowledge is in the land and languages, and revitalization of this knowledge can protect soil health. So with that, I'll end my remarks and thank you all for your time. Thank you. Thank you all and merci.
Thanks very much. And I neglected to say that we're timing, and at 1 minute I will put my hand up for the other speakers. And when two hands go up, it means you should wrap up. Thanks very much. So moving on to Ms. Pete-Cardoso, please.
Good morning. Danse Kakio, Candice Pete-Cardoso, Nitsigason, Waskachuse, Uchenia, Treaty 6 territory. Good morning. My name is Candice Pete-Cardoso, and I'm from the Little Pine First Nation, Treaty 6 territory. I am the director of the Indigenous Land Management Institute, soon to be renamed to the Kichi-Okawimawaski Great Mother Earth Knowledge Center. We have spent the last year working with Indigenous peoples from various First Nations and national and provincial Indigenous-led organizations to reimagine what a land-focused center should look like here at the University of Saskatchewan. The work of the steering committee has resulted in the following vision. Kichi-Okawimawaski, Great Mother Earth, Kamihinan, you have given us. The Matsuwin is life. Pokokwesk, Manachihitatan, we are obligated to respect her in the right way. And our mission, which is working with and for Indigenous peoples to empower land governance by leveraging the teaching, research, and engagement capacity at the University of Saskatchewan. The center has a responsibility to advocate for Kichi-Okawimawaski, for Mother Earth, and today we have the responsibility to advocate for the health of the land. Dr. Arcand mentioned that the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the land has been damaged by colonization. To expand on this, in a recent presentation by David Nawigabo, he spoke to how law is used as a tool of the colonizer, that laws are developed within colonial institutions and where settlers created and assumed sovereignty over Indigenous peoples, and I will add, over Indigenous territories. There have been many tools developed in the form of legislation and policy. The Indian Act is just one example of those tools of colonization. From this legislation was born many policy regimes that resulted in the reserve system, the pass system, residential schools, and agricultural policy meant to stop Indigenous peoples' efforts to engage in the agricultural economy. This included policy that resulted in the loss of the highest quality agricultural reserve land through surrenders. Any conversation about soil health and Indigenous peoples must include the voices of Indigenous peoples at those tables. Conversations must include concepts around Indigenous sovereignty over our lands and Indigenous knowledge. We have heard from previous witnesses that soils vary in their ability to perform ecosystem services. From an Indigenous worldview, we do not commodify the land, and we do not solely value the land based on its potential to generate revenue. Land is viewed as a living, breathing ecosystem and territory, a kin connection, and a place that we must learn from, nurture, and sustain. First Nations vary widely in the number and capacity of staff involved in making land management decisions with implications to caretaking of soil health. For many First Nations across the prairies, there may be a single land manager who is responsible for an expansive range of duties, one of which may be negotiating and administering permits and leases with producers to rent reserve farmland. However, if the land manager leadership or members of a land advisory committee don't have a strong foundation in agriculture, including soil management, soils have the potential to be degraded. Current federal government support for the training of First Nation land managers is limited to First Nations under various federal land regimes. Resource allocations for land management should be expanded to all First Nations in Canada. Resource allocation for training should expand beyond the resourcing for one trainee per nation. The current structure of land management regimes are paternalistic, are in need of reform. In their current state, they put soil health at risk. Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.